of confessions and disavowals. He could not bear to think of her disillusionment. He felt that he owed it to her not to disillusion her, to spoil things for her in that fashion. To turn into something mean and ugly after she has believed in me, it would be like playing a practical joke upon her. It would be like taking her into my arms and suddenly making a grimace at her. It would scar her with a second humiliation. Should he take her on to Bath or Exeter tomorrow to contrive by some sudden arrival of telegrams that he had to go from her suddenly? But a mere sudden parting would not end things between them now, unless he went off abruptly without explanations or any arrangements for further communications. At the outset of this escapade, there had been a tacit but evident assumption that it was to end when she joined her father at Falmouth. It was with an effect of discovery that Sir Richmond realized that now it could not end in that fashion, that with the whisper of love and the touching of lips, something had been started that would go on, that would develop. To break off now and go away without a word would leave a raw and torn end, would leave her perplexed and even more humiliated, with an aching mystery to distress her. Why did he go? Was it something I said? Something he found out or imagined? Parting had disappeared as a possible solution of this problem. She and he had got into each other's lives to stay. The real problem was the terms upon which they were to stay in each other's lives. Close association had brought them to the point of being, in the completest sense, lovers. That could not be. And the real problem was the transmutation of their relationship to some form compatible with his honor and her happiness. A word, an idea from some recent reading floated into Sir Richmond's head. Sublimate, he whispered. We have to sublimate this affair. We have to put this relationship upon a higher plane. His mind stopped short at that. Presently his voice sounded out of the depths of his heart. God, how I loathe the higher plane. God has put me in this higher plane business like some poor little kid who has to wear iron on its legs. I want her. Do you hear, Martin? I want her. As if by a lightning flash, he saw his car with himself and Miss Grammont. Miss Seyffert had probably fallen out, traversing Europe and Asia in headlong flight to a sunlit beach in the South Seas. His thoughts presently resumed, though, as these unmannerly and fantastic interruptions had not occurred. We have to carry the whole affair on a higher plane and keep it there. We two love one another. That has to be admitted now. I ought never to have touched her. I ought never to have thought of touching her. But we are too high. Our aims and work and obligations are too high for any ordinary lovemaking. That sort of thing would embarrass us, would spoil everything. Spoil everything, he repeated, rather like a small boy who learns an unpalatable lesson. For a time, Sir Richmond, exhausted by moral effort, lay staring at the darkness. It has to be done. I believe I can carry her through with it, if I can carry myself. She's a finer thing than I am. On the whole, I am glad it's only one more day. Belinda will be about. Afterwards, we can write to each other. If we can get over the next day, it will be all right. Then we can write about fuel and politics, and there won't be her voice and her presence. We shall really sublimate. First class idea, sublimate. And I will go back to dear old Martin, who's all alone there and miserable. I'll be kind to her and play my part and tell her her carbuncle scar rather becomes her, and in a little while I shall be altogether in love with her again. Queer what a brute I've always been to Martin. Queer that Martin can come in a dream to me and take the upper hand with me. Queer that now I love Martin. He thought still more profoundly. By the time the committee meets again, I shall have been tremendously refreshed. He repeated, put things on the higher plane and keep them there, then go back to Martin, and so to the work. That's it. Nothing so pacifies the mind as a clear-cut purpose. Sir Richmond fell asleep during the fourth recapitulation of this program. Section 3. When Miss Grammont appeared at breakfast, Sir Richmond saw at once that she too had had a restless night. When she came into the little long breakfast room of the inn with its brown screens and its neat white tables, it seemed to him that the Miss Grammont of his nocturnal speculations, the beautiful young lady who had been protected and managed and loved unselfishly, vanished like some exorcised intruder. Instead was this real dear young woman who had been completely forgotten during the reign of her simulacrum, and who now returned completely remembered, familiar, friendly, intimate. She touched his hand for a moment. She met his eyes with the shadow of a smile in her own. Oranges, said Belinda, from the table by the window. Beautiful oranges. She had been preparing them, poor transatlantic exile, after the fashion in which grapefruits are prepared upon liners and in the civilized world of the West. He is getting us teaspoons, said Belinda as they sat down. This is really England than ever, she said. I've been up an hour. I found a little path down the river bank. It's the greenest morning world and full of wild flowers. Look at these. That's Lady Smock, said Sir Richard. It's not really a flower. It's a quotation from Shakespeare. And there are cowslips. Cuckoo buds of yellow hue do paint the meadows with delight. All the English flowers come out of Shakespeare. I don't know what we did before his time. The waiter arrived with the teaspoons for the oranges. Belinda, having distributed these, resumed her discourse of enthusiasm for England. She asked a score of questions about Gloucestershire and Chepstow and Severn and the Romans and the Welsh, and did not wait for the answers. She did not want answers. She talked to keep things going. Her talk masked a certain constraint that came upon her companions after the first morning's greetings were over. Sir Richmond, as he had planned upstairs, produced 2 Michelin maps. Today, he said, we will run back to Bath, from which it will be easy for you to take a train to Falmouth. We will go by Monmouth and then turn back through the Forest of Dean, where you will get glimpses of primitive coal mines still worked by 2 men and a boy, and a windlass and a pail. Perhaps we will go through Cirencester. I don't know. Perhaps it is better to go straight to Bath. In the very heart of Bath, you will find yourselves in just the same world you visited at Pompeii. Bath is Pompeii overlaid by Jane Austen's England. He paused for a moment. We can wire to your agents from here before we start, and we can pick up their reply at Gloucestershire or Nailsworth, or even Bath itself. So that if your father is nearer than we suppose, but I think tomorrow afternoon will be soon enough from Falmouth anyhow. He stopped interrogatively. Miss Grammont's face was white. That will do very well, she said. Section 4. They started, but presently they came to high banks that showed such masses of bluebells, ragged robin, great stitchwort, and the like that Belinda was not to be restrained. She clamoured to stop the car and go up the bank and pick her hands full, so that they drew up by the roadside, and Sir Richmond and Miss Grammont sat down near the car while Belinda carried her enthusiastic onslaught of the flowers up the steep bank and presently out of earshot. The 2 lovers said unheeded things about the flowers to each other and then fell silent. Then Miss Grammont turned her head and seemed deliberately to measure her companion's distance. Evidently she judged her out of earshot. Well, said Mrs. Grammont, in her soft, even voice, we love one another. Is that so, still? I could not love you more. It wasn't a dream, no. And tomorrow we part? He looked in her eyes. I have been thinking of that all night, he said at last. I too. And you think? That we must part. Just as we arranged it. When was it? 3 days or 3 ages ago. There is nothing else in the world to do except for us to go our ways. I love you. That means, for a woman, it means that I want to be with you. But that is impossible. Don't doubt whether I love you because I say impossible. Sir Richmond, faced with his own nocturnal decision, was now moved to oppose it flatly. Nothing that one can do is impossible. She glanced again at Belinda and bent down towards him. Suppose, she said, you got back into that car with me. Suppose that instead of going on as we have planned, you took me away. How much of us would go? You would go, said Sir Richmond, and my heart. And this work of yours, and your honour, for the honour of a man in this new age of yours will be the first of all the work he does for the world. And will you leave your work to be just a lover? And the work that I might do because of my father's wealth, all that would vanish too. We would leave all that, all of our usefulness, all that much of ourselves. But what has made me love you? Just your breadth of vision, just the sense that you mattered. What has made you love me? Just that I have understood the dream of your work, all that we should have to leave behind. We should specialize in our own scandal. We should run away just for one thing, to think, by sharing the oldest, simplest, dearest indulgence in the world, that we had got each other, when really we had lost each other, lost all that mattered. Her face was flushed, and with the earnestness of her conviction, her eyes were bright with tears. Don't think I don't love you. It's so hard to say all this. Somehow it seems like going back on something supreme. Our instincts have got us. Don't think I'd hold myself from you, dear. I'd give myself to you with both hands. I love you. When a woman loves, at any rate, she loves altogether. But this thing I am convinced cannot be. I must go on my way, the way I have to go. My father is the man, obstinate, more than half a savage. For me, I know it. He has a jealousy of 10 husbands. If you take me, if our secret becomes manifest, if you are to take me and keep me, then his life and your life will become wholly this feud. Nothing but this feud. You have to fight him anyhow. That is why I, of all people, must keep out of the quarrel. For him, it would be an immense excitement, full of the possibility of fierce satisfactions. For you, whether you won me or lost me, it would be utter waste and ruin. She paused and then went on. And for me too, waste and ruin. I shall be a woman fought over. I shall be fought over as dogs fight over a bone. I shall sink back from the level of Helen of Troy. I shall cease to be a free citizen, a responsible free person. Whether you win me or lose me, it will be a waste and ruin for both of us. Your fuel commission will go to pieces. All the wide, enduring work you have set me dreaming about will go the same way. We shall just be another romantic story. No. Sir Richmond sat still, a little like a sullen child, she thought. I hate all this, he said slowly. I don't think of your father before, and now I think of him, it sets me bristling for a fight. It makes all this harder to give up. And yet, do you know, in the night I was thinking, I was coming to conclusions, very like yours, for quite other reasons. I thought we ought not to. We have to keep friends anyhow, and hear of each other. That goes without saying. I thought we ought not to go on to be lovers in that way. That would affect you, touch you too closely. I was sorry I had kissed you. Not I, no, don't be sorry for that. I am glad we have fallen in love. More glad than I have been of anything else in my life, and glad we have spoken plainly, though we have to part. And her whisper came close to him. For a whole day yet, all round the clock, twice, you and I have one another. Miss Seifert began speaking as soon as she was well within earshot. I don't know the name of a single one of these flowers, she cried, except the bluebells. Look at this great handful I've gotten. Springtime in Italy doesn't compare with it, not for a moment. Section 5. Because Belinda Seifert was in the dicky behind them, with her alert interest in their emotions all too thinly and obviously veiled, it seemed more convenient to Sir Richmond and Miss Grammont to talk not of themselves, but of man and woman, and of that new age according to the prophet Martineau, which Sir Richmond had partly described and mainly invented and ascribed to his departed friend. They talked anthropologically, philosophically, speculatively, with an absurd pretense of detachment. They sat side by side in the little car, scarcely glancing at one another, but side by side and touching each other, and all the while they were filled with tenderness and love and hunger for one another. In the course of a day or so, they had touched on nearly every phase in the growth of man and woman from that remote and brutish past which has left its traces in human bones, mingled with the bones of hyenas and cave bears beneath the stalagmites of Wookey Hole near Wales. In those nearly forgotten days, the mind of man and woman had been no more than an evanescent succession of monstrous and infantile imaginations. That brief journey in the West Country had lit up phase after phase in the long teaching and discipline of man as he had developed depth and memory and fixity of purpose out of these raw beginnings through the dreaming childhood of Avebury and Stonehenge and the crude boyhood of ancient wars and massacres. Sir Richmond recalled those phases now, and how, as they had followed one another, man's idea of woman and woman's idea of man had changed with them, until nowadays, in the minds of civilized men, brute desire and possession and a limitless jealousy has become almost completely overlaid by the desire for fellowship and a free mutual loyalty. Overlaid, he said. The older passions are still there, like the fires in an engine. He invented a saying for Dr. Martineau that the man in us today was still the old man of the Paleolithic times, with his will, his wrath against the universe increased rather than diminished. If today he ceases to crack his brother's bones and rape and bully his womankind, it is because he has grown up to a greater game and means to crack this world and feed upon its marrow and wrench their secrets from the stars. And furthermore, it would seem that the prophet Martineau had declared that in this new age that was presently to dawn for mankind, jealousy was to be disciplined, even as we had disciplined lust and anger. Instead of ruling our law, it was to be ruled by law and custom. No longer were the jealousy of strange peoples, the jealousy of ownership, and the jealousy of sex to determine the framework of human life. There was to be one peace and law throughout the world, one economic scheme, and a universal freedom for men and women to possess and give themselves. And how many generations yet must there be for we to reach that utopia? Miss Grammont asked. I wouldn't put it at a very great distance, but think of all the confusions in the world. Confusions merely? The world is just a muddle of states and religions and theories and stupidities. There are great lumps of disorderly strength in it, but as a whole, it is a weak world. It goes on by habit. There's no great idea in possession, and the only possible great idea is this one. The new age may be nearer than we dare to suppose, if I could believe that. There are many more people who think as we do than you suppose. Are you and I such very strange and wonderful and exceptional people? No, I don't think so. And yet, the new world is already completely established in our hearts. What has been done in our minds can be done in most minds. In a little while, the muddled, angry mind of man upon his planet will grow clear, and it will be this idea that will have made it clear. And then life will be very different for everyone. The tyranny of disorder which oppresses every life on earth now will be lifted. There will be less and less insecurity, less and less irrational justice. It will be a better instructed and a better behaved world. We shall live at our ease, not perpetually anxious, not resentful and angry, and that will alter all the rules of love. Then we shall think more of the loveliness of other people, because it will no longer be necessary to think so much of the dangers and weaknesses and pitifulness of other people. We shall not have to think of those who depend upon us for happiness and self-respect. We shall not have to choose between a wasteful fight for a personal end or the surrender of our heart's desire. Heart's desire, she whispered. Am I indeed your heart's desire? Sir Richmond sank his head and voice in response. You are the best of all things, and I have to let you go. Sir Richmond suddenly remembered Miss Seyffert and half turned his face towards her. Her forehead was just visible over the hood of the open coupe. She appeared to be intelligently intent upon the scenery. Then he broke out suddenly into a tirade against the world. But I am bored by this jostling, unreasonable world. At the bottom of my heart, I am bitterly resentful today. This is a world of fools and brutes in which we live, a world of idiotic traditions, imbecile limitations, cowardice, habit, greed, and mean cruelty. It is a slum of a world, a congested district, an insanitary jumble of souls and bodies. Every good thing, every sweet desire is thwarted, every one. I have to lead a life of a slum missionary, a sanitary inspector, an underpaid teacher. I am bored. Oh God, how I am bored. I am bored by our laws and customs. I am bored by our rotten empire and its empty monarchy. I am bored by its parades and its flags and its sham enthusiasms. I am bored by London and its life, by its smart life and by its servile life alike. I am bored by theatres and by books and by every sort of thing that people call pleasure. I am bored by the brag of people and the claims of people and the feelings of people. Damn people. I am bored by profiteers and by the snatching they call business enterprise. Damn every businessman. I am bored by politics and the universal mismanagement of everything. I am bored by France, by Anglo-Saxondom, by Germany self-pity, by Bolshevik fanaticism. I am bored by these fools' squabbles that devastate the world. I am bored by Ireland, orange and green, and I am bored by India and by Egypt. I am bored by anyone who professes to have rights. Damn their rights, curse their rights. I am bored to death by this year, and by last year, and by the prospect of next year. I'm bored. I'm horribly bored by my work. I am bored by every sort of renunciation. I want to live with the woman I love, and I want to work within the limits of my capacity. He had come round a corner at 25 miles an hour, and had stopped his spark and pulled up neatly within a yard of the fore-wheel of a wagon that was turning in the road so as to block the way completely. They almost had me. And now you feel better? Said Miss Grammont. Ever so much, said Sir Richmond, and chuckled. The wagoner cleared the road and the car started up again. For a minute or so, neither spoke. You ought to be smacked hard for that outbreak, my dear, said Miss Grammont. I ought, my dear. I have no right to be ill-tempered. We two are among the supremely fortunate ones of our time. We have no excuse for misbehaviour. Got nothing to grumble at. Always I am lucky. That, with the wagon, was the very near thing. God spoils us. We two, he went on after a pause, are among the most fortunate people alive. We are both rich and easily rich. That gives us freedom as few people have. We have a vision of the whole world in which we live. It's in a mess, but that is by the way. The mass of mankind never gets enough education to have even a glimpse of the world as a whole. They never get a chance to get the hang of it. It is really possible for us to do things that will matter in the world. All our time is our own. All our abilities we are free to use. Most people, most intelligent and educated people, are caught in cages in pecuniary necessity. They are tied to tasks they can't leave. They are driven and compelled and limited by circumstances they can never master. But we, if we have tasks of our own choosing. We may not like the world, but anyhow we are free to do our best to alter it. If I were a clerk in Hoxton and you were a city typist, then we might swear. It was you who swore, smiled Miss Grammont. It's the thought of that clerk in Hoxton and that city typist who really keep me at my work. Any smacking ought to come from them. I couldn't do less than I do in the face of their helplessness. Nevertheless, a day will come, through what we do and what we refrain from doing, when there will be no bound and limited clerks in Hoxton, and no captive typists in the city, and nobody at all to consider, according to the prophet Martineau, said Miss Grammont. And then you and I must contrive to be born again. Hi-ho, cried Miss Grammont, 1,000 years ahead, when fathers are civilized, when all these phantom people who intervene on your side know I don't want to know anything about them, but I know of them by instinct, when they also don't matter. Then you and I can have things out with each other, thoroughly, said Sir Richmond, with a surprising ferocity in his voice, charging the little hill before him as though he charged at time. Section 6. They had to wait at Nailsworth for a telegram from Mr. Grammont's agents. They lunched there and drove on to Bath in the afternoon. They came into the town through unattractive and unworthy outskirts, and only realized the charm of the place after they had garaged their car at the Pulteney Hotel and worked back over the Pulteney Bridge to see the Avon with the pump room and the Roman baths. The Pulteney they found hung with pictures and adorned with sculpture to an astonishing extent. Some former proprietor must have had a mania for replicas, and the place is eventful with white marble fawns and sylphs and lions and Caesars and Queen Victorias, and packed like an exhibition with memories of Rome, Florence, Milan, Paris, the National Gallery, and the Royal Academy, amidst which splendours a competent staff administers modern comforts with an old-fashioned civility. But round and about the Pulteney one has still the scenery of Georgian England, the white, faintly classical terraces, and the houses of the days of Fielding, Smollett, Fanny Burney, and Jane Austen. The graceful bridge with the bright little shops full of presents from Bath, the pump room with its water drinkers, and a fine array of the original Bath chairs. Down below the pump room, our travellers explored the memories of the days when the world was Latin from York to the Tigris, and the Corinthian capital flourished like a weed from Bath to Baalbek. And they considered a little doubtfully the 17th century statue of Bladud, who is said to have been healed by the Bath waters, and who have founded the cities in the days when Stonehenge still flourished 800 years before the Romans came. In the afternoon, Miss Seyffert came with Sir Richmond and Miss Grammont, and was very enthusiastic about everything. But in the evening, after dinner, it was clear that her role was to remain in the hotel. Sir Richmond and Miss Grammont went out into the moonlit gloaming. They crossed the bridge again and followed the road beside the river towards the old Abbey Church, that lantern of the West. Away in some sunken gardens ahead of them, a band was playing, and a cluster of little lights about the bandstand showed a crowd of people down below dancing on the grass. These little lights, these booming black heads, and the lilting music, this little inflamed centre of throbbing sounds and ruddy illumination, made the dome of the moonlit world about it seem very vast and cool and silent. Our visitors began to realize that Bath could be very beautiful. They went to the parapet above the river and stood there, leaning over it elbow to elbow and smoking cigarettes. Miss Grammont was moved to declare the Pulteney Bridge, with its noble arch, its effect of height over the swirling river, and the cluster of houses above, more beautiful than the Ponte Vecchio at Florence. Down below was a man in waders, with a fishing rod going to and fro along the foaming weir, and a couple of boys paddled a boat against the rush of the water lower down the stream. "Dear England," said Miss Grammont, surveying this gracious spectacle, "how full it is of homely and lovely and kindly things. It is the home we come from. You belong to it still. No more than you do. I belong to a big overworking modern place called London, which stretches its tentacles all over the world. I am as much a homecoming tourist as you are. Most of this western country I am seeing for the first time." She said nothing for a space. I've not a word to say tonight, she said. I'm just full of a sort of animal satisfaction in being close to you and in being with you among lovely things somewhere before we part tonight. Yes, he said to her pause, and his face came very near to hers. I want you to kiss me. Yes, he said awkwardly, glancing over his shoulder, acutely aware of the promenaders passing close to them. It's a promise, yes. Very timidly and guiltily, his hand sought hers beside his and gripped it and pressed it. My dear, he whispered, tritest and most unavoidable of expressions. It was not very like man and woman loving upon their planet. It was more like the shy endearments of the shop boys and work girls who made the darkling populace about them with their silent interchanges. There are 1,000 things I want to talk to you about, she said. After we have parted tomorrow, I shall begin to think of them, but now every rational thing seems dissolved in this moonlight. Presently, she made an effort to restore the intellectual dignity of their relationship. I suppose I ought to be more concerned tonight about the work I have to do in the world and anxious for you to tell me this and that, but indeed, I am not concerned at all about it. I seem to have it in outline all perfectly clear. I mean to play a man's part in the world just as my father wants me to do. I mean to win his confidence and work with him like a partner. Then someday I shall be a power in the world of fuel. At the same time, I must watch and read and think and learn how to be the servant of the world. We two have to live like trusted servants who have been made guardians of a helpless minor. We have to put things in order and keep them in order against the time when man whom we call in America the common man, can take hold of his world. And release his servants, said Sir Richmond. All that is perfectly clear in my mind. That is what I am going to live for. That is what I have to do. She stopped abruptly. All that is about as interesting tonight in comparison with the touch of your dear fingers as next month's railway timetable. But later she found a topic that could hold their attention for a time. We have never said a word about religion, she said. Sir Richmond paused for a moment. I am a godless man, he said. The stars and space and time overwhelm my imagination. I cannot imagine anything above or beyond them. She thought that over. But there are divine things, she said. You are divine. I'm not talking lovers' nonsense, he hastened to add. I mean that there is something about human beings, not just the everyday stuff of them, but something that appears intermittently, as though a light shone through something translucent. If I believe in any divinity at all, it is a divinity revealed to me by other people, and even by myself in my own heart. I'm never surprised at the badness of human beings, said Sir Richmond, seeing how they have come about and what they are, but I have been surprised time after time by fine things, often in people I disliked or thought little of. I can understand that I find you full of divine quality because I am in love with you and all alive with you. Necessarily, I keep on discovering loveliness in you. But I have seen divine things in dear old Martineau, for example. A vain man, fussy, timid, and yet filled with a passion for truth, ready to make great sacrifices and to toil tremendously for that. And in those men I am always cursing my committee. It is astonishing at times to discover what streaks of goodness even the really bad men can show. But one can't make use of just anyone's divinity. I can see the divinity in Martineau, but it leaves me cold. It tires me and bores me. But I live on you. It's only through love that the gods can reach over from one human being to another. All real love is a divine thing, a reassurance, a release of courage. It is wonderful enough that we should take food and drink and turn them into imagination, invention, and creative energy. It is still more wonderful that we should take an animal urging and turn it into a light to discover beauty and an impulse towards the utmost achievements of which we are capable. All love is a sacrament, and all lovers are priests to each other, you and I. So Richmond broke off abruptly. I spent 3 days trying to tell this to Dr. Martineau, but he wasn't the priest I had to confess to, and the words wouldn't come. I can confess it to you readily enough. I cannot tell, said Miss Grammont, whether this is the last wisdom in life or moonshine. I cannot tell whether I am thinking or feeling, but the noise of the water going over the weir below is like the stir in my heart, and I am swimming in love and happiness. Am I awake or am I dreaming you? And are we dreaming one another? Hold my hand, hold it hard and tight. I'm trembling with love for you and all the world. If I say more, I shall be weeping. For a long time they stood side by side, saying not a word to one another. Presently the band down below and the dancing ceased and the little lights were extinguished. The silent moon seemed to grow brighter and larger, and the whisper of the waters louder. A crowd of young people flowed out of the gardens and passed by on the way home. Sir Richmond and Miss Grammont strolled through the dispersing crowd and over the toll bridge, and went exploring down a little staircase that went down from the end of the bridge to the dark river, and then came back to their old position at the parapet, looking upon the weir and the Pulteney Bridge. The gardens that had been so gay were already dark and silent as they returned, and the streets echoed emptily to the few people who were still abroad. It's the most beautiful bridge in the world, said Miss Grammont, and gave him her hand again. Some deep-toned clock close by proclaimed the hour 11. The silence healed again. Well, said Sir Richmond. Well, said Miss Grammont, smiling very faintly. I suppose we must go out of all this beauty now, back to the lights of the hotel and the watchful eyes of your dragon. She has not been a very exacting dragon so far, has she? She is a miracle of tact. She does not really watch, but she is curious and very sympathetic. She is wonderful. That man is still fishing, said Miss Grammont. For a time she peered down at the dark figure wadding in the foam below as though it was the only thing of interest in the world. Then she turned to Sir Richmond. I would trust Belinda with my life, she said. And anyhow, now we need not worry about Belinda. Section 7. At the breakfast table it was Belinda who was the most nervous of the three. The most moved, the most disposed to throw a sacramental air over their last meal together. Her companions had passed beyond the idea of separation. It was as if they now cherished a secret satisfaction at the high dignity of their parting. Belinda in some way perceived that they had become different. They were no longer tremulous lovers. They seemed sure of one another and with a new pride in their bearing. It would have pleased Belinda better, seeing how soon they were to be torn apart, if they had not quite made such excellent breakfasts. She even suspected them of having slept well. Yet yesterday they had been deeply stirred. They had stayed out late last night, so late that she had not heard them come in. Perhaps they had passed the climax of their emotions. Sir Richmond, she learnt, was to take the party to Exeter, where there would be a train for Falmouth a little after 2. If they started from Bath about 9, that would give them an ample margin of time in which to deal with a puncture or any such misadventure. They crested the Mendips above Shepton Mallet, ran through Tilchester and Ilminster into the lovely hill country about up Ottery, and so to Honiton and the broad level road to Exeter. Sir Richmond and Miss Grammont were in a state of happy gravity. They sat contentedly side by side, talking very little. They had already made their arrangements for writing to one another. There was to be no stream of love letters or protestations. That might prove a mutual torment. Their love was to be implicit. They were to write at intervals about political matters and their common interests, and to keep each other informed of their movements about the world. We shall be working together, she said, speaking suddenly out of a train of thought she had been following. We shall be closer together than many a couple who have never spent a day apart for 20 years. Then presently she said, "In the new age, all lovers will have to be accustomed to meeting and parting. We women will not be tied very much by domestic needs, unless we see fit to have children. We shall be going about our business like men. We shall have worldwide businesses, many of us, just as men will. It will be a world full of lovers' meetings. Someday, somewhere, we two will certainly meet again, even if you have to force circumstances a little," said Sir Richmond. "We shall meet," she said, "without doing that." "But where?" he asked, unanswered. "Meetings and partings," she said. "Women will be used to seeing their lovers go away, even to seeing them go away to other women who have borne them children and who have a closer claim on them." "No one," began Sir Richmond, startled. "But I don't mind very much. It's how things are. If I were a perfectly civilized woman, I shouldn't mind at all. If men and women are not to be tied to each other, there must needs be such things as this." "But you," said Sir Richmond, "I at any rate am not like that. I cannot bear the thought that you—" "You need not bear it, my dear. I was just trying to imagine this world that is to be. Women, I think, are different from men in their jealousy. Men are jealous of the other man, women are jealous for their man, and care less about the other woman. What I love in you, I am sure about. My mind was empty when it came to you, and now it is full to overflowing. I shall feel you moving about in the same world with me. I'm not likely to think of anyone else for a very long time. Later on, who knows, I may marry. I make no vows, but I think until I know certainly that you do not want me anymore, it will be impossible for me to marry or to have a lover. I don't know, but that is how I believe it will be with me. And my mind feels beautifully clear now and settled. I've got your idea and made it my own. Your idea that we matter scarcely at all, but that the work we do matters supremely. I'll find my rope and tug it, never fear. Halfway round the world, perhaps, someday, you will feel me tugging." "I shall feel you there," he said, "whether you tug or not. 3 miles left to Exeter," he reported presently. She glanced back at Belinda. "It is good that we have loved, my dear," she whispered. "Say it is good." "The best thing in all my life," he said, and lowered his head and voice to say, "My dearest dear." "Heart's desire still?" "Heart's delight, priestess of life, divinity." He smiled and nodded, and suddenly Belinda, up above their lowered heads, accidentally and irreverently, no doubt coughed. At Exeter Station there was not very much time to spare after all. Hardly had Sir Richmond secured a luncheon basket for the two travellers before the train came to the station. He parted from Miss Grammont with a hand-clasp. Belinda was flushed and distressed at the last, but her friend was quiet and still. "Au revoir," said Belinda without conviction, when Sir Richmond shook her hand. Section 8. Sir Richmond stood quite still on the platform as the train ran out of the station. He did not move until it had disappeared round the bend. Then he turned, lost by a brown study, and walked very slowly towards the station exit. "The most wonderful thing in my life," he thought, "and already it is unreal. She will go on to her father, whom she knows 10,000 more times thoroughly than she knows me. She will go on to Paris. She will pick up all the threads of her own story, be reminded of endless things in her life, but never, except in the most casual way of these days, they will be cut off from everything else that will serve to keep them real. And as for me, this connects me with nothing else in all my life at all. It is as disconnected as a dream. Already it is hardly more substantial than a dream. We shall write letters. Do letters breathe faster or slower as you read them? We may meet. Where are we likely to meet again? I never realized before how improbable it is that we shall meet again. And if we meet, never in all our lives shall we be really together again. It's over with a completeness, like death. He came opposite the bookstalls and stopped short and stared with unseeing eyes at the display of popular literature. He was wondering now whether after all he ought to have let her go. He experienced something of the blank amazement of a child who has burst its toy balloon. His golden globe of satisfaction in an instant had gone. An irrational sense of loss was flooding every other feeling about Vivi. If she had loved him truly, and altogether, could she have left him like this? Neither of them surely had intended so complete a separation. He wanted to go back and recall that train. A few seconds more, he realized that he would give way to anger. Whatever happened, that must not happen. He pulled himself together. What was it he had to do now? He had not to be angry. He had not even to be sorry. They had done the right thing. Outside the station, his car was waiting. He went outside the station and started at the car. He had to go somewhere, of course, down to Cornwall, to Martin's cottage. He had to go down to her and to be kind and comforting about the carbuncle. To be kind, if this thwarted feeling broke out into anger, he might be tempted to take it out on Martin. That, at any rate, he must not do. He had always, for some inexplicable cause, treated Martin badly, nagged her and blamed her and threatened her. That must stop now. No shadow of this affair must lie on Martin, and Martin must never have a suspicion of any of this. The image of Martin became very vivid in his mind. He thought of her as he had seen her many times, with the tears close, fighting with her back to the wall, with all her wit and vigour gone, because she loved him more steadfastly than he did her. Whatever happened, he must not take it out of Martin. It was astonishing how real she had become now, as Vivi became a dream. Yes, Martin was astonishingly real, and if only he could go now and talk to Martin and face all the facts of life with her, even as he had done with that phantom Martin in his dream. But things were not like that. He looked to see if his car was short of water or petrol. Both needed replenishing, and so he would have to go up the hill to Exeter town again. He got into his car and sat down with his fingers on the electric starter. Martin, old friend, 8 days were still left before the committee met again. 8 days for golden kindness. He would distress Martin by no clumsy confession. He would just make her happy as she loved to be made happy. Nevertheless, was it Martin who failed him, or he who failed Martin? Incessant and insoluble dispute. Well, the thing now was to go to Martin, and then the work. He laughed suddenly. I'll take it out of the damned commission. I'll make old Rumford Brown sit up. He was astonished to find himself thinking of the affairs of the commission with a lively interest and no trace of fatigue. He had had his change. He had taken his rest. He was equal to his task again already. He started his engine and steered his way past the van and the waiting cab. Fuel, he said. Chapter 9. The Last Days of Sir Richmond Hardy. Section 1. The majority and minority reports of the Fuel Commission were received on their first publication with much heat and disputation, but there is already a fairly general agreement that they are a great and significant document, broadly conceived and historically important. They do lift the questions of fuel supply and distribution high above the level of parochial jealousies and above the petty and destructive profiteering of private owners and traders, to a view of a general human welfare. They form an important link in a series of private and public documents that are slowly opening out a prospect of new economic methods, methods conceived in the generous spirit of scientific work, that may yet arrest the drift of our Western civilization towards financial and commercial squalor and the social collapse that must ensue inevitably on that. In view of the composition of the committee, the majority report is in itself an amazing triumph of Sir Richmond's views. It is astonishing that he was able to drive his opponents so far and then leave them there securely advanced while he carried on the adherents he had altogether won including, of course, the Labour representatives to the further altitudes of the Minority Report. After the summer recess, the Majority Report was discussed and adopted. Sir Richmond had shown signs of flagging energy in June, but he had come back in September in a state of exceptional vigour. For a time, he completely dominated the committee by the passionate force of his convictions and the illuminating scorn he brought to bear on the various subterfuges and weakening amendments by which the meaner interests sought to save themselves, in whole or in part, from the common duty of sacrifice. But towards the end he fell ill. He had worked to the pitch of exhaustion. He neglected a cold that settled on his chest. He began to cough persistently and betray an increasingly irritable temper. In the last fights in the committee, his face was bright with fever, and he spoke in a voiceless whisper, often a vast angry whisper. His place at table was marked with scattered lozenges and scraps of paper torn into the minutest shreds. Such good manners as had hitherto mitigated his behaviour on the committee departed from him. He carried his last points, gesticulating and coughing and wheezing rather than speaking. But he had so hammered his ideas into the committee that they took the effect of what he was trying to say. He died of pneumonia at his own house 3 days after the passing of the Majority Report. The Minority Report, his own especial creation, he never signed. It was completed by Waston Carmichael. After their parting at Salisbury Station, Dr. Martineau heard very little of Sir Richmond for a time except through the newspapers, which contained frequent allusions to the committee. Someone told him that Sir Richmond had been staying at Rouen in Cornwall, where Martin Leeds had a cottage, and someone else had met him at Bath on his way, he said, in his car from Cornwall to a conference with Sir Peter Davis in Glamorganshire. But in the interim, Dr. Martineau had the pleasure of meeting Lady Hardy at a luncheon party. He was seated next to her, and he found her very pleasing and sympathetic a person indeed. She talked to him freely and simply of her husband and of the journey the two men had taken together. Either she knew nothing of the circumstances of their parting, or if she did not betray her knowledge. That holiday did him a world of good, she said. He came back to his work like a giant. I feel very grateful to you. Dr. Martineau said it was a pleasure to have helped Sir Richmond's work in any way. He believed in him thoroughly. Sir Richmond was inspired by great modern creative ideas. Forgive me if I keep you talking about him, said Lady Hardy. I wish I could feel as sure that I had been of use to him. Dr. Martineau insisted, I know very well that you are. I do what I can to help him carry his enormous burden of toil, she said. I try to smooth his path, but he is a strange, silent creature at times. Her eyes scrutinized the doctor's face. It was not the doctor's business to supplement Sir Richmond's silences, yet he wished to meet the requirements of this lady if he could. He is one of those men, he said, who are driven by forces they do not fully understand. A man of genius. Yes, she said, in an undertone of intimacy. Genius, a great, irresponsible genius, difficult to help. I wish I could do more for him. A very sweet and charming lady. It was with the great regret that the doctor found the time had come to turn to his left-hand neighbour. Section 2. It was with some surprise that Dr. Martineau received a fresh appeal for aid from Sir Richmond. It was late in October, and Sir Richmond was already seriously ill. But he was still going about his business as though he was perfectly well. He had not mistaken his man. Dr. Martineau received him as though there had never been a shadow of offence between them. He came straight to the point. Martineau, he said, I must have those drugs I asked you for when first I came to you now. I must be bolstered up. I can't last out unless I am. I'm at the end of my energy. I come to you because, you will understand, the commission can't go on now for more than another 3 weeks. Whatever happens afterwards, I must keep going until then. The doctor did understand. He made no vain objections. He did what he could to patch up his friend for his last struggles with the opposition in the committee. Pro forma, he said, stethoscope in hand. I must order you to bed. You won't go, but I order you. You must know that what you are doing is risking your life. Your lungs are congested. The bronchial tubes already. That may spread at any time. If this open weather lasts, you may go about and still pull through. But at any time this may pass into pneumonia. And there's not much in you just now to stand up against pneumonia. I'll take all reasonable care. Is your wife at home? She is in Wales with her people, but the household is well trained. I can manage. Go in a closed car from door to door. Wrap up like a mummy. I wish the committee room wasn't down those abominable House of Commons corridors. They parted with an affectionate handshake. Section 3. Death approved of Sir Richmond's determination to see the committee through. Our universal creditor gave this particular debtor grace to the very last meeting. Then he brushed a gust of chilly rain across the face of Sir Richmond as he stood waiting for his car outside the stranger's entrance to the house. For a couple of days, Sir Richmond felt almost intolerably tired, but scarcely noted the changed timbre of the wheezy notes in his throat. He rose later each day with ebbing vigour, jotted down notes and corrections upon the proofs of the minority report. He found it increasingly difficult to make decisions. He would correct and alter back and then repeat the correction, perhaps half a dozen times. On the evening of the second day, his lungs became painful and his breathing difficult. His head ached and a sense of some great impending evil came upon him. His skin was suddenly a detestable garment to wear. He took his temperature with a little clinical thermometer he kept by him and found it was 101. He telephoned hastily to Dr. Martineau and without waiting for his arrival, took a hot bath and got into bed. He was already thoroughly ill when the doctor arrived. Forgive my sending for you, he said. Not your line, I know. My wife's GP, an exasperating sort of ass. Can't stand him, no one else. He was lying on a narrow little bed and with a hard pillow that the doctor replaced by one from Lady Hardy's room. He had twisted the bedclothes into a hopeless muddle. The sheet was on the floor. Sir Richmond's bedroom was a large apartment in which sleep seemed to have been an admitted necessity rather than a principal purpose. On one hand, it opened into a business-like dressing room and bathroom. On the other, into the day study. It bore witness to the nocturnal habits of a man who had long lived a life of irregular impulses to activity and dislocated hours and habits. There was a desk and reading lamp for night work near the fireplace, an electric kettle for making tea at night, a silver biscuit tin, all the apparatus for the lonely, intent industry on the small hours. There was a bookcase of blue books, books of reference and such like material, and some files. Over the mantelpiece was an enlarged photograph of Lady Hardy and a plain office calendar. The desk was littered with a galley proofs of the minority report, upon which Sir Richmond had been working up to the moment of his hasty retreat to bed. And the lying among the proofs, as though it had been taken out and looked at quite recently, was the photograph of a girl. For a moment, Dr. Martineau's mind hung in doubt, and then he knew it for the young American of Stonehenge. How that affair had ended he did not know, and now it was not his business to know. These various observations printed themselves on Dr. Martineau's mind after his first cursory examination of his patient, and while he cast about for anything that would give this large, industrious apartment a little more of the restfulness and comfort of a sick room. I must get in a night nurse at once, he said. We must find a small table somewhere to put near the bed. I'm afraid you are very ill, he said, returning to the bedside. This is not, as you say, my sort of work. Will you let me call in another man, a man we can trust thoroughly, a consultant? I'm in your hands, said Sir Richmond. I want to pull through. He will know better where to get the right sort of nurse for the case and everything. The second doctor presently came with the right sort of nurse hard on his heels. Sir Richmond submitted almost silently to his expert handling and was sounded and looked to and listened at. Said the second doctor, and then encouragingly to Sir Richmond, we've got to take care of you. There's a lot about this I don't like, said the second doctor, and drew Dr. Martineau by the arm towards the study. For a moment or two, Sir Richmond listened to the low murmur of their voices, but he did not feel very deeply interested in what they were saying. He began to think what a decent chap Dr. Martineau was, how helpful and fine and forgiving his professional training had made him, how completely he had ignored the smothered incivilities of their parting at Salisbury. All men ought to have such training. Not a bad idea to put every boy and girl through a year or so of hospital service. Sir Richmond must have dozed, for his next perception was of Dr. Martineau standing over him and saying, I'm afraid, my dear Hardy, that you are very ill indeed. Much more so than I thought you were at first. Sir Richmond's raised eyebrows conveyed that he accepted this fact. I think Lady Hardy ought to be sent for. Sir Richmond shook his head with unexpected vigour. Don't want her about, he said, and after a pause, don't want anybody about. But if anything happens, send then. An expression of obstinate calm overspread Sir Richmond's face. He seemed to regard the matter as settled. He closed his eyes. For a time, Dr. Martineau desisted. He went to the window and turned to look again at the impassive figure on the bed. Did Sir Richmond fully understand? He made a step towards his patient and hesitated. Then he brought a chair and sat down at the bedside. Sir Richmond opened his eyes and regarded him with a slight frown. A case of pneumonia, said the doctor, after great exertion and fatigue, may take very rapid and unexpected turns. Sir Richmond, cheek on pillow, seemed to assent. I think if you want to be sure that Lady Hardy sees you again, if you don't want to take risks about that, one never knows in these cases, probably there is a night train. Sir Richmond manifested no surprise at the warning, but he stuck to his point. His voice was faint but firm, couldn't make anything up to say to her, anything she'd like. Dr. Martineau rested on that for a little while. Then he said, if there is anyone else? Not possible, said Sir Richmond with his eyes on the ceiling, but to see. Sir Richmond turned his head to Dr. Martineau, his face puckered like a peevish child's. They'd want things said to them, things to remember. I can't. I'm tired out. Don't trouble, whispered Dr. Martineau, suddenly remorseful. But Sir Richmond was also remorseful. Give them my love, he said. Best of love, old Martin. Love. Dr. Martineau was turning away when Sir Richmond spoke again in a whisper. Best love. Poor at the best. He dozed for a time. Then he made a great effort. I can't see them, Martineau, until I've something to say. It's like that. Perhaps I shall think of some kind of things to say after a sleep. But if they came now, I'd say something wrong. Be cross, perhaps. Hurt someone. I've hurt so many. People exaggerate. People exaggerate importance these occasions. Yes, yes, whispered Dr. Martineau. I quite understand. Section 4. For a time, Sir Richmond dozed. Then he stirred and muttered, second rate, poor at the best, love, work, all. It had been splendid work, said Dr. Martineau, and was not sure that Sir Richmond heard. Those last few days lost my grip, always lose my damned grip. Rag them. Put their backs up, silly. Never done anything well. It's done. Done. Well or ill. Done. His voice sank to the faintest whisper. Done forever and ever, and ever and ever. Again he seemed to doze. Dr. Martineau stood up softly. Something beyond reason told him that this was certainly a dying man. He was reluctant to go, and he had an absurd desire that someone for whom Sir Richard cared, should come and say goodbye to him. And for Sir Richard to say goodbye to someone, he hated this lonely launching from the shores of life of one who had sought intimacy so persistently and vainly. It was extraordinary. He saw it now for the first time. He loved this man. If it had been in his power, he would at that moment have anointed him with kindness. The doctor found himself standing in front of the untidy writing desk, littered like a recent battlefield. The photograph of the American girl drew his eyes. What had happened? Was there not perhaps some word for her? He turned about as if to inquire of the dying man and found Sir Richmond's eyes open and regarding him. In them he saw an expression he had seen there once or twice before, a faint but excessively irritating gleam of amusement. "Oh, well," said Dr. Martineau, and turned away. He went to the window and stared out as his habit was. Sir Richmond continued to smile dimly at the doctor's back until his eyes closed again. It was their last exchange. Sir Richmond died that night in the small hours, so quietly that, for some time, the night nurse did not observe what had happened. She was indeed roused to that realization by the ringing of the telephone bell in the adjacent study. Section 5. For a long time that night, Dr. Martineau had lain awake, unable to sleep. He was haunted by the figure of Sir Richmond, lying on his uncomfortable little bed in his big bedroom, and by the curious effect of loneliness produced by the nocturnal desk, and by the evident dread felt by Sir Richmond of any deathbed partings. He realized how much this man, who had once sought so feverishly for intimacies, had shrunken back upon himself, how solitary his motives had been, how rarely he had taken counsel with anyone in his later years. His mind now dwelt apart. Even if people came about him, he would still be facing death alone. And so it seemed he meant to slip out of life, as a man might slip out of a crowded assembly, unobserved. Even now he might be going. The doctor recalled how he and Sir Richmond had talked of the rage of life in a young baby, how we drove into life in a sort of fury, how that rage impelled us to do this and that, how we fought and struggled until the rage spent itself and was gone. That eddy of rage was Sir Richmond and was now perhaps very near its end. Presently it would fade and cease, and the stream that had made it and borne it would know it no more. Dr. Martineau's thoughts relaxed and passed into the picture land of dreams. He saw the figure of Sir Richmond, going as it were away from him along a narrow path, a path that followed the crest of a ridge between great darknesses, enormous cloudy darknesses, above him and below. He was going along this path without looking back, without a thought for those he left behind, without a single word to cheer him on his way, walking as Dr. Martineau had sometimes watched him walking, without haste or avidity, walking as a man might along some great picture gallery with which he was perhaps even over-familiar. His hands would be in his pockets, his indifferent eyes upon the clouds about him. And as he strolled along that path, the darkness closed in upon him. His figure became dim and dimmer. Whither did that figure go? Did that enveloping darkness hide the beginnings of some strange, long journey, or would it just dissolve that figure into itself? Was that indeed the end? Dr. Martineau was of that large class of people who can neither imagine nor disbelieve in immortality. Dimmer and dimmer grew the figure, but still it remained visible, as one can continue to see a star at dawn until one turns away, or one blinks or nods, and it is gone. Vanished now are the beliefs that held our race for countless generations. Where now was that path of the dead mapped so clearly, faced with such certainty, in which the Paleolithic peoples believed from Avebury to Polynesia? Not always have we had to go alone and unprepared into uncharted darknesses. For a time, the dream artist used the palette of the doctor's vague memories of things Egyptian. He painted a new roll of the Book of the Dead, at a copy of which the doctor had been looking a day or so before. Sir Richmond became a broken, naked figure, crossing a bridge of danger, passing between terrific monsters, ferrying a dark and dreadful stream. He came to the scales of judgment before the very throne of Osiris, and stood waiting while dog-headed Anubis weighed his conscience, and that evil monster, the devourer of the dead, crouched ready if the judgment went against him. The doctor's attention concentrated upon the scales. A memory of Swedenborg's heaven and hell mingled with the Egyptian fantasy. Now at last it was possible to know something real about this man's soul. Now at last one could look into the secret places of the heart. Anubis and Thoth, the god of the ibis head, was riding the heart as if it were a book, reading aloud from it to the supreme judge. Suddenly the doctor found himself in his own dreams. His anxiety to plead for his friend had brought him in. He too had become a little painted figure, and he was bearing the book in his hand. He wanted to show that the laws of the new world could not be the same as those of the old, and the book he was bringing as evidence was his own psychology of a new age. The clear thought of that book broke up his dream by releasing a train of waking troubles. You have been 6 months on chapter 10. Will it ever be ready for Osiris? Or will it ever be ready for print? Dream and waking thoughts were mingled like sky and cloud upon a windy day in April. Suddenly he saw again that lonely figure on the narrow way, with darknesses above and darknesses below, and darknesses on every hand. But this time it was not Sir Richmond. Who was it? Surely it was Everyman. Everyman had to travel at last along that self-same road, leaving love, leaving every task and every desire. But was it Everyman? A great fear and horror came upon the doctor. That little figure was himself, and the book, which was his particular task in life, was still undone. He himself stood in his turn upon that lonely path with the engulfing darknesses about him. He seemed to wrench himself awake. He lay very still for some moments, and then he sat up in bed. An overwhelming conviction had arisen in his mind that Sir Richmond was dead. He felt he must know for certain. He switched on his electric light, mutely interrogated his round face reflected in the looking-glass, got out of bed, shuffled on his slippers, and went along the passage to the telephone. He hesitated for some seconds and then lifted the receiver. It was his call which aroused the nurse to the facts of Sir Richmond's death. Section 6. Lady Hardy arrived home in response to Dr. Martineau's telegram late on the following evening. He was with her next morning, comforting and sympathetic. Her big blue eyes, bright with tears, met his very wistfully. Her little body seemed very small and pathetic in its simple black dress, and yet there was a sort of bravery about her. And when he came into the drawing room, she was in one of the window recesses talking to a serious-looking woman of a dressmaker type. She left her business at once to come to him. "Why did I not know in time?" she cried. "No one, dear lady, had any idea until late last night," he said, taking both her hands in his for a long, friendly, sympathetic pressure. "I might have known that if it had been possible, you would have told me," she said. "You know," she added, "I don't believe it yet. I don't realize it. I go about these formalities. I think I can understand that. He was always, not quite here. It is as if he were a little more not quite here. I can't believe it is over." She asked a number of questions and took the doctor's advice upon various details of the arrangements. "My daughter Helen comes home tomorrow afternoon," she explained. "She is in Paris, but our son is far, far away in the Punjab. I have sent him a telegram. It is so kind of you to come in to me." Dr. Martineau went more than halfway to meet Lady Hardy's disposition to treat him as a friend of the family. He had conceived a curious, half-maternal affection for Sir Richmond that had survived even the trying incident of the Salisbury parting and revived very rapidly during the last few weeks. This affection extended itself now to Lady Hardy. Hers was a type that had always appealed to him. He could understand so well the perplexed loyalty with which she was now setting herself to gather together some preservative and reassuring evidences of this man who had always been, as she put it, never quite here. It was as if she felt that now it was at last possible to make a definite reality of him. He could be fixed, and as he was fixed, he would stay. Nevermore would he be able to come in and, with an almost expressionless glance, wither the interpretation she had imposed upon him. She was finding much comfort in this task of reconstruction. She had gathered together in the drawing room every presentable portrait. He had never, she said, sat to a painter, but there was an early pencil sketch done within a couple of years of their marriage. There was a number of photographs, several of which she wanted the doctor's advice upon this point. She thought might be enlarged. There was a statuette done by some woman artist who had once beguiled him into a sitting. There was also a painting she had had worked up from a photograph and some notes. She flitted among these memorials, going from one to the other, undecided which to make the standard portrait. That painting, I think, is most like, she said, as he was before the war, but the war and the commission changed him, worried him and aged him. I grudged him to that commission. He let it worry him frightfully. It meant very much to him, said Dr. Martineau. It meant too much to him, but of course his ideas were splendid. You know, it is one of my hopes to get some sort of book done, explaining his ideas. He would never write, he despised it, unreasonably. A real thing done, he said, was better than 1,000 books. Nobody read books, he said, but women, parsons, and idle people. But there must be books, and I want one. Something a little more real than the ordinary official biography. I have thought of young Leighton, the secretary of the commission. He seems thoroughly intelligent and sympathetic and really anxious to reconcile Richmond's views and those of the big businessmen on the committee. He might do, or perhaps I might be able to persuade 2 or 3 people to write down their impressions of him. A sort of memorial volume. But he was shy of friends. There was no man he talked to very intimately about his ideas unless it was to you. I wish I had the writer's gift, Doctor. Section 7. It was on the second afternoon that Lady Hardy summoned Dr. Martineau by telephone. Something rather disagreeable, she said, if you could spare the time, if you could come round. It's frightfully distressing, she said when he got round to her, and for a time she could tell him nothing more. She was having tea and she gave him some. She fussed about with cream and cakes and biscuits. He noted a crumpled letter thrust under the edge of the silver tray. He talked, I know, very intimately with you, she said, coming to it at last. He probably went into things with you that he never talked about with anyone else. Usually he was very reserved. Even with me, there were things about which he said nothing. We did, said Dr. Martineau, with discretion, deal a little with his private life. There was someone. Dr. Martineau nodded, and then, not to be too portentous, took and bit a biscuit. Did he by any chance ever mention someone called Martin Leeds? Dr. Martineau seemed to reflect. Then, realizing that this was a mistake, he said, he told me the essential facts. The poor lady breathed a sigh of relief. I'm glad, she said simply. She repeated, yes, I'm glad. It makes things easier now. Dr. Martineau looked his inquiry. She wants to come and see him. Here? Here. And Helen here? And the servants noticing everything. I have never met her, never set eyes on her. For all I know, she may want to make a scene. There was infinite dismay in her voice. Dr. Martineau was grave. You would rather not receive her? I don't want to refuse her. I don't want even to seem heartless. I understand, of course. She had a sort of claim. She sobbed her reluctant admission. I know it, I know. There was much between them. Dr. Martineau pressed the limp hand upon the little tea table. I understand, dear lady, he said. I understand. Now, suppose I were to write to her and arrange. I do not see that you need to be put to the pain of meeting her. Suppose I were to meet her here myself. If you could. The doctor was quite prepared to save the lady any further distresses, no matter at what trouble to himself. You are so good to me, she said, letting the tears have their way with her. I am silly to cry, she said, dabbing her eyes. We will get it over tomorrow, he reassured her. You need not think of it again. He took over Martin's brief note to Lady Hardy and set to work by telegram to arrange for her visit. She was in London at her Chelsea flat and easily accessible. She was to come to the house at midday on the morrow and to ask not for Lady Hardy but for him. He would stay by her while she was in the house, and it would be quite easy for Lady Hardy to keep herself and her daughter out of the way. They could, for example, go out quietly to the dressmaker's in the closed car, for many little things about the morning still remained to be seen. Section 8. Miss Martin Leeds arrived punctually, but the doctor was well ahead of his time and ready to receive her. She was ushered into the drawing room where he awaited her. As she came forward, the doctor first perceived that she had a very sad and handsome face, the face of a sensitive youth rather than the face of a woman. She had fine grey eyes under very fine brows. They were eyes that at other times might have laughed very agreeably, but which were now full of unrestrained sadness. Her brown hair was very untidy and parted at the side, like a man's. Then he noted that she seemed to be very untidily dressed, as if she was that rare and, to him, very offensive thing, a woman careless in her beauty. She was short in proportion to her broad figure and her broad forehead. You are Dr. Martineau, she said. He talked of you. As she spoke, her glance went from him to the pictures that stood about the room. She walked up to the painting and stood in front of it with her distressed gaze wandering about her. Horrible, she said. Absolutely horrible. Did she do this? Her question disconcerted the doctor very much. You mean Lady Hardy? He asked. She doesn't paint. No, I mean, did she get all these things together? Naturally, said Dr. Martineau. None of them are a bit like him. They are like blows aimed at his memory. Not one has his life in it. How could she do it? Look at that idiot statuette. He was extraordinarily difficult to get. I have burnt every photograph I had of him for fear that this would happen, that he would go stiff and formal, just as you have got him here. I have been trying to sketch him almost all the time since he died, but I can't get him back. He's gone. She turned to the doctor again. She spoke to him, not as if she expected him to understand her, but because she had to say these things which burdened her mind to someone. I have done hundreds of sketches. My room is littered with them. When you turn them over, he seems to be lurking among them, but not one of them is like him. She was trying to express something beyond her power. It is as if someone had suddenly turned out the light. She followed the doctor upstairs. This was his study, the doctor explained. I know it. I came here once, she said. They entered the big bedroom in which the coffin body lay. Dr. Martineau, struck by a sudden memory, glanced nervously at the desk, but someone had made it quite tidy, and the portrait of Alice Grammont had disappeared. Miss Leeds walked straight across to the coffin and stood looking down on the waxen, inexpressive dignity of the dead. Sir Richmond's brows and nose had become sharper and more clear-cut than they had ever been in life, and his lips had set into a faint, insane smile. She stood quite still for a long time. At length she sighed deeply. She spoke, a little as though she thought aloud, a little as though she talked at that silent presence in the coffin. I think he loved, she said. Sometimes I think he loved me, but it is hard to tell. He was kind, he could be intensely kind, and yet he didn't seem to care for you. He could be intensely selfish, and yet he didn't certainly not care for himself. Anyhow, I loved him. There is nothing left in me now to love anyone else forever. She put her hands behind her back and looked at the dead man with her head a little on one side. Too kind, she said very softly. There was a sort of dishonesty in his kindness. He would not let you have the bitter truth. He would not say he did not love you. He was too kind to life ever to call it the foolish thing it is. He took it seriously because it takes itself seriously. He worked for it and killed himself with work for it. She turned to Dr. Martineau, and her face was streaming with tears. And life, you know, isn't to be taken seriously. It's a joke, a bad joke made by some cruel little god who has caught a neglected planet, like torturing a stray cat. But he took it seriously, and he gave up his life for it. There was much happiness he might have had. He was very capable of happiness, but he never seemed happy. This work of his came before it. He overworked and fretted our happiness away. He sacrificed his happiness and mine. She held out her hands towards the doctor. What am I to do now with the rest of my life? Who is there to laugh with me now and jest? I don't complain of him. I don't blame him. He did his best to be kind. But all my days now I shall mourn for him and long for him. She turned back to the coffin. Suddenly she lost every vestige of self-control. She sank down on her knees beside the trestle. Why have you left me? She cried. Oh, speak to me, my darling, speak to me, I tell you, speak to me. It was a storm of passion, monstrously childish and dreadful. She beat her hands upon the coffin. She wept loudly and fiercely as a child does. Dr. Martineau drifted feebly to the window. He wished he had locked the door. The servants might hear and wonder what it was all about. Always he had feared love for the cruel thing it was, but now it seemed to him for the first time that he realized its monstrous cruelty. The end. This has been The Secret Places of the Heart by H.G. Wells, narrated by Sam Kusi.